I was 12 when it happened. A sweltering July afternoon, the kind that clings to your skin and fills the air with the smell of hot asphalt. I came home from soccer practice to find the front door ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. It wasn't unusual for my parents to leave the door unlocked during the day, but something felt different this time. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the tension. My mom was in the living room, pacing. My dad sat at the dining table, staring blankly at a half-empty cup of coffee. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. "Mom? Dad?" I said, setting my soccer bag down by the door. My voice sounded too loud, cutting through the uneasy quiet. My mom stopped pacing. She looked at me, her face a mix of exhaustion and something I couldn't quite place. "Aaron, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I froze. Those words, "we need to talk," never led to anything good. My dad gestured for me to sit. "Aaron," he started, his voice flat, "we've been thinking." And then they told me. It didn't matter how much they tried to sugarcoat it. They had decided that raising me was no longer something they could handle. I was going to stay with Aunt Linda for a while. A while turned into forever. That night, I packed a bag and climbed into Aunt Linda's car, leaving the house I'd grown up in behind me. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just stared out the window, watching the world blur as we drove away. I told myself I wouldn't look back. Aunt Linda wasn't a bad person. In fact, she was the kind of woman who made the best out of the worst situations. Her tiny one-bedroom apartment smelled like lavender and cinnamon, and she always kept a tin of homemade cookies on the counter. But for all her kindness, she was not my parents. She worked long hours as a nurse, often leaving me alone in the evenings with instructions to heat up leftovers or do my homework. Those quiet nights, the walls seemed to close in around me. I would sit at the kitchen table, staring at my unfinished math problems, and wonder what I had done wrong. Linda never pried into why my parents sent me to live with her, and I didn't have the courage to ask. Maybe part of me didn't want to hear the answer. She tried to keep my life as normal as possible, enrolling me in school, signing me up for soccer, even coming to my games when her schedule allowed. But there were always reminders that I didn't belong, like the whispers from classmates when they found out I wasn't living with my mom and dad. Sometimes, late at night, I would catch Linda watching me from across the room with a look of quiet concern. She never said anything, but her eyes were full of questions she was too gentle to ask. Years passed in this limbo. I grew taller, older, but the wound left by my parents' absence never truly healed. I stopped hoping for phone calls, for letters, for any sign they might want me back. They had disappeared from my life as if I were a chapter in their story they had decided to skip. But no matter how hard I tried to bury the pain, there was one day I couldn't escape it, my birthday. Every year, I would blow out the candles on my cake and wish for the same thing, that my parents would come back, tell me it was all some terrible mistake. By the time I was 18, I stopped making wishes altogether. And then, on the eve of my 22nd birthday, I received an invitation that changed everything. It came in a crisp, cream-colored envelope, tucked beneath a stack of mail on Aunt Linda's kitchen counter. I almost didn't notice it, distracted by the usual pile of bills and grocery store flyers. But when I flipped through the stack, the elegant handwriting caught my eye. I held the envelope in my hands, the weight of it heavier than paper should be. My name was written in blue ink, no return address, just an intricate seal pressed into the flap. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding. Inside was a single card. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Michael and Susan Harper. My parents. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The names stared back at me like ghosts. Michael and Susan Harper. My mom and dad. They were getting remarried. To each other. The date was only 2 weeks away. The ceremony would take place in a sprawling vineyard estate a few hours' drive from the city. There was no note, no explanation, just the invitation and an RSVP card. I stood there in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands, as a flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. After 10 years of silence, this was how they chose to reach out? No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just a wedding invitation, as if the past decade had never happened. I tossed the card onto the counter and walked out of the kitchen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. The invitation burned in my mind, the words looping endlessly, cordially invited. When Aunt Linda came home later that evening, she found me sitting on the couch, the invitation still in my lap. Her face softened when she saw it. "So, they finally reached out," she said quietly, sitting down beside me. "Why now?" I asked, my voice raw. She didn't have an answer. "Are you going to go?" she asked after a long pause. I didn't know. A part of me wanted to rip the invitation in half and pretend it never existed. Another part wanted answers. I wanted to stand in front of them and ask the questions I'd been too afraid to ask all these years. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The anger, the confusion, the flicker of curiosity, they all churned inside me like a storm. I had 2 weeks to decide. The days passed slowly, each one an endless tug-of-war between my emotions. I tried to distract myself with work, with friends, with anything to keep me from thinking about the invitation that still sat on the kitchen counter. But no matter what I did, my mind always drifted back to it. By the time the RSVP deadline loomed, I still hadn't made up my mind. Aunt Linda noticed my restlessness, though she gave me space to figure it out on my own. It wasn't until the night before the RSVP was due that she finally spoke up. "I know it's not my place, Aaron," she said as we sat together in the living room, her knitting needles clicking softly. "But sometimes, closure is more important than pride." "Closure?" I scoffed. "What kind of closure do I get from sitting in a crowd and watching them play Happy Family?" "Maybe none," she admitted. "But maybe seeing them again will give you some clarity about them, about yourself. You've been carrying this weight for a long time." Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. I stared at the RSVP card, the box for accepts with pleasure still blank. Could I really face them after all these years? Could I sit across from the people who had abandoned me and pretend everything was fine? I grabbed the pen before I could change my mind. With shaking hands, I checked the box. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie. My reflection stared back at me, equal parts apprehension and determination. "Are you sure about this?" Aunt Linda asked, leaning against the doorframe. "No," I admitted, my voice soft. "But I think I need to do it anyway." She gave me a small, encouraging smile. "You've grown into an incredible man, Aaron. They don't deserve you, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve your answers." Her words gave me the final push I needed. With a deep breath, I picked up the invitation and left for the vineyard. The drive to the vineyard felt longer than it actually was. Every mile I covered seemed to stretch endlessly, my thoughts circling back to the same unanswerable questions. Why had they abandoned me? Why now, after 10 years of silence, did they think it was okay to invite me into their lives like nothing had happened? Did they regret it? Or worse, had they never thought about me at all? The vineyard came into view as I turned onto a gravel road lined with towering cypress trees. The estate was sprawling, the kind of place reserved for picturesque weddings and glossy magazine spreads. Rows of vines stretched into the horizon, their emerald leaves gleaming under the summer sun. Guests were already milling about near the main hall, dressed in crisp suits and flowing dresses. I parked my car at the far end of the lot, taking a moment to gather myself. My heart pounded against my ribs as I smoothed my tie and stepped out of the car. Each step toward the crowd felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of a decade of unanswered questions was dragging me down. At the entrance to the hall, an usher greeted me with a polite smile and handed me a program. I glanced at it briefly, the names Michael Harper and Susan Harper printed in elegant gold script. My throat tightened. As I stepped into the hall, I scanned the room, trying to spot them. It was surreal, seeing so many people I didn't know, laughing and mingling, celebrating a marriage that felt like a cruel joke to me. I noticed a few familiar faces from my childhood, family friends, distant relatives, but no one seemed to notice me. I was a stranger at my own parents' wedding. And then, I saw them. They stood at the far end of the room, talking to a small group of guests. My dad was dressed in a sharp black suit, his hair grayer than I remembered, but his posture as confident as ever. My mom wore a flowing white dress, her laughter ringing out like music. For a moment, I was struck by how little they had changed. They looked so happy. I froze, my feet refusing to move any closer. A strange mix of anger and longing surged through me, twisting my stomach into knots. What was I supposed to do? Walk up to them and say, "Hi, remember me? The son you left behind?" Before I could decide, someone touched my arm. Aaron? I turned to see a woman I recognized immediately, Mrs. Green, our old neighbor from when I was a kid. Her face lit up with surprise and warmth. "Oh my goodness, it's you. I haven't seen you in years." I forced a smile, my throat dry. "Hi, Mrs. Green. It's been a while." Her expression softened. "I'm so glad you came. Your parents will be thrilled to see you." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "Will they?" She looked at me curiously, as if sensing the weight behind my words, but before she could say anything more, the music shifted. The guests began to take their seats, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. Mrs. Green patted my arm gently. "Go on," she said. "Find a seat. I'm sure this will be good for all of you." I wasn't so sure. The ceremony was beautiful, objectively speaking. The golden sunlight streaming through the windows, the string quartet playing softly, the vows exchanged with carefully chosen words, it was everything a wedding was supposed to be. But I couldn't focus on any of it. As I sat near the back, my eyes stayed fixed on my parents. My dad's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her forever. My mom's eyes shone with tears as she echoed the words. To everyone around me, it was a picture-perfect moment of love and commitment. To me, it was a lie. The applause that erupted as they kissed felt like static in my ears. I clapped mechanically, my hands moving without thought. The guests began to file out into the courtyard for the reception, their laughter and chatter filling the air. I stayed in my seat, unsure if I even wanted to stay for the reception. What was the point? I'd seen what I came to see, two people who had moved on without me. But then, as the crowd thinned, I saw my mom glance in my direction. For a brief moment, her eyes locked onto mine. Her smile faltered, her expression shifting into something I couldn't quite read. Recognition? Shock? Guilt? She leaned over to my dad, whispering something in his ear. His head snapped up, and he followed her gaze toward me. And just like that, I wasn't invisible anymore. They started walking toward me, weaving through the remaining guests with hesitant steps. My mom clutched her bouquet tightly, her knuckles white, while my dad adjusted his tie as if he needed something to do with his hands. For a fleeting second, I thought about leaving, just standing up and walking out before they reached me. But I couldn't. "Aaron," my mom said softly as they stopped a few feet away. Her voice was just as I remembered it, gentle, musical. For a moment, I was 12 years old again, standing in that living room as she told me I couldn't stay with them anymore. My dad was the first to break the awkward silence. "It's good to see you," he said, his tone warm but guarded. "Is it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I saw my mom flinch, but I couldn't bring myself to apologize. She stepped forward slightly, her eyes brimming with what I thought might be guilt. "Aaron, we didn't know if you'd come. We hoped you would." I folded my arms across my chest, trying to keep the anger from spilling out too fast. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "It's not every day you get a wedding invitation from the parents who abandoned you." My dad winced at the word, his jaw tightening. "Aaron, it wasn't like that." "Wasn't it?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You sent me away. You didn't call. You didn't write. You disappeared. What else would you call it?" My mom opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to my dad, as if she was hoping he would know what to say. "Aaron," he began, his tone steady but tinged with frustration, "there's more to the story than you realize. We didn't want to send you away. We didn't have a choice." I let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't have a choice? You're telling me you couldn't even try to keep me?" That you couldn't figure something out in 10 years? That's what you want me to believe? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. It wasn't about figuring something out. It was about protecting you. I froze, the words catching me off guard. Protecting me? From what? My mom finally found her voice. Aaron, you were so young, and there were things happening, things we didn't want you to be exposed to. It wasn't safe for you to stay with us. What things? I demanded, my frustration mounting. What could possibly justify throwing me out of your life like that? For a moment, neither of them spoke. My dad ran a hand through his hair, and my mom clutched the edge of her bouquet like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. It was my fault, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. And your father, he thought the only way to fix it was to keep you away from it all. What kind of mistakes? I asked, my stomach churning. She glanced at my dad again, and he gave her a subtle nod. Her voice trembled as she said, I was struggling with things I couldn't control. I had an addiction, Aaron. It wasn't safe for you to be around me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Addiction? I had spent years imagining every possible reason they might have abandoned me, but this wasn't one of them. We thought sending you to Linda was the best way to protect you, my dad added. She could give you the stability we couldn't. We didn't want you to see us at our worst. But why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice cracking. Why didn't you explain? Why didn't you come back when things got better? My mom's tears spilled over, streaking her carefully done makeup. Because I was ashamed. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. The anger I had carried for so long clashed with the flood of emotions I felt now: shock, hurt, confusion. Why now? I asked after a long silence. Why invite me here after all these years? My dad took a deep breath, his expression heavy. Because we're finally in a place where we can face the past. And because we want you back in our lives, Aaron. If you'll let us. I stared at them, my parents, two people who had once been my whole world and then vanished from it. Their words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, but they didn't erase the years of pain and loneliness I'd endured. The reception carried on around us, a blur of music, clinking glasses, and laughter. But for me, the world had shrunk to the three of us standing in that small corner of the vineyard. I don't know if I can just forget, I said finally, my voice quieter now. Do you have any idea what it was like? Wondering why I wasn't enough? Why you didn't want me? My mom's face crumpled, and she reached out as if to touch my arm but stopped short. Aaron, it was never about you not being enough. We were the ones who weren't enough. I didn't want my mistakes to ruin you. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her as more than the woman who had let me go. She was flawed, broken, but she was trying. We made so many mistakes, my dad said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. But inviting you here wasn't about pretending those years didn't happen. It was about trying to start over. The word start over echoed in my mind. Could I start over? Could I rebuild something from the rubble they had left behind? I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted, the honesty slicing through the air. Not yet. My dad nodded, his expression somber but understanding. We're not asking for forgiveness today. We're just asking for a chance to show you we've changed. I looked between them, the people who had shaped me and scarred me in equal measure. My chest felt tight, but a small, cautious voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. I'll think about it, I said finally. It wasn't the reunion they might have hoped for, but it was all I could give. My mom nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. That's all we could ask for. And with that, I turned and walked back toward the edge of the reception, my heart heavy but just a little bit lighter than before. That night, I drove home in silence, the events of the day replaying in my mind. I didn't feel relief or closure, just a strange emptiness, like I had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through. When I got back to Aunt Linda's, the house was dark except for the light above the kitchen sink. She had left a note on the counter, a simple hope it went okay. Cookies in the tin. Her quiet support, as always, steadied me in ways I didn't realize I needed. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of everything. My parents' confession swirled in my mind. Addiction. Protecting me. Shame. I had waited years for answers, and now that I had them, I didn't know how to feel. As I leaned back, exhausted, something caught my eye on the bedside table. It was a small envelope with my name on it, written in Aunt Linda's handwriting. Curious, I opened it. Inside was an old, faded letter. At the top, the date was scrawled in uneven handwriting, July 13, 2013. My 12th birthday. I began to read. Dear Aaron. I hope this letter finds its way to you one day, even if I'm too afraid to give it to you now. I don't know how to explain why your dad and I made the choice we did, but I need you to know that it wasn't because we didn't love you. It was because we did. I've made mistakes, Aaron. Big ones. I'm not the mom you deserve, and the last thing I ever wanted was for you to see me like this. Your dad and I thought Aunt Linda could give you the kind of life we couldn't right now. I wish I could promise you that things will get better soon, but I don't want to lie to you. What I can promise is that not a day goes by when we don't think about you, love you, and miss you. You are the best thing I ever did, Aaron, and I hope one day you'll understand. Love always? Mom. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I clutched the letter, my chest aching. This was the piece I hadn't realized I was missing, their pain, their regret, even back then. They hadn't forgotten me. I sat there for hours, the letter pressed against my chest, as the years of anger and resentment began to shift. It didn't erase the hurt, but it opened a door I thought had been closed forever. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the paper soft and worn from years of folding. Aunt Linda was pouring coffee when she noticed it. You found it, she said softly, sitting across from me. You've had this the whole time? I asked, my voice a mix of surprise and emotion. She nodded. Your mom gave it to me the day you came to live here. She couldn't bring herself to give it to you directly. I didn't think it was my place to decide when you should read it, so I kept it safe until you were ready. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to be angry that I hadn't seen it sooner, but a larger part of me knew that finding it now, after the wedding, after hearing their side, felt like it was meant to happen this way. What are you going to do? Aunt Linda asked gently. I stared at the letter, the weight of the decision settling over me. I don't know, I admitted. But I think I owe it to myself to see where this goes. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a small cafe. My parents had asked if we could meet, and after days of deliberation, I finally said yes. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and there they were, sitting at a corner table, looking nervous and out of place. They both stood when they saw me, my mom's eyes already brimming with tears. I hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting down. Thank you for coming, my dad said, his voice earnest. I'm not here to forgive you, I said quickly, setting the tone. I'm not ready for that. We understand, my mom replied, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them on the table. But I am here to talk, I continued. If we're going to do this, I need honesty. No more half-truths, no more avoiding the hard stuff. I deserve that much. My dad nodded, and my mom reached into her bag, pulling out a small stack of photos. She slid them across the table to me. These are from the years we lost, she said quietly. We didn't stop thinking about you, Aaron. We kept track of your birthdays, your soccer games, everything Aunt Linda shared with us. We were there in the only way we knew how to be at the time. I hesitated before picking up the photos. The first one was of them holding a small birthday cake, my name written in shaky frosting. Another showed my dad holding a printed program from one of my soccer games. Each photo was proof of the quiet, unseen ways they had tried to stay connected, even when they couldn't be there. It didn't erase the hurt, but it chipped away at the wall I had built around myself. We spent hours at that table, talking about the past, about the choices they made, and about the lives we had lived apart. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the old anger surged up, but for the first time, I felt like we were starting to build something real. Months passed, and little by little, we began to find a rhythm. We weren't a family in the traditional sense, there were still scars, still unspoken hurts, but we were trying. My mom started calling every Sunday, and my dad and I went to a baseball game together for the first time since I was a kid. Aunt Linda watched it all unfold with quiet pride. "You're stronger than you think, Aaron," she told me one evening as we shared a plate of cookies. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about healing. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I was finally willing to walk it, one step at a time.